Hey everybody, it's Joe Trippi and welcome back to That Trippi Show. This week, I'm really excited. We have not one but two special guests who are here to break down some of the wildest stories about the aftermath of 2020 and Trump's attempt to overthrow the election. Authors of Find Me the Votes, a hard-charging Georgia prosecutor, a rogue president, and the plot to steal an American election, Michael Isikoff and Daniel Klaidman. These are two guys who, if they show up on your call sheet, you should probably be pretty worried. Daniel's previous editor-in-chief of Yahoo News, Washington bureau chief at Newsweek. Michael was the chief investigative correspondent at Yahoo News, a former investigative correspondent at NBC, The Post. Before I welcome you guys in, I just want to say to our listeners, I concur after reading this book with Douglas Brinkley, who called it a narrative wake-up call and a hell of a great read. It is just a page turner, and I just think connects so many dots. Michael, Daniel, welcome.
Thanks, Joe. Good to be with you. Yep.
Good to be with you,
Yeah.
and thank you for the praise.
No, it's great. Alex, where do you want to get started?
So we were talking pre-show about this, Joe. You said, and I agree with you totally, that the biggest eye-opener for you, in the book, there's a chapter called A Confederate in the Attic. And I thought that would be a really good place to start there. I mean, we might end up doing the whole show just on this, but Joe, it is wild. I mean, the whole book is, but this particular chapter is just, so Joe, where do you want to get started?
So, yeah, I mean, I read this and I never have seen so many dots connected in a single chapter in any book on all this stuff on January 6th and the post-election crisis. And it really was eye-opening. And so I'd really like to start there. You guys, I mean, can you explain to our viewers who the hell Chester Doles is? You know, and you quote him in the book saying, we need to get this Civil War started. And I think it really does reflect a lot of what's going on out there.
Exactly. Look, Chester Doles is one of these fascinating characters who sort of bubbled up from the political netherworld as a result of Trump's presidency and his attempts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. He's a former Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon, a guy who spent multiple years in prison for beating up a black man in his youth and later spent time in federal prison on federal firearms charges. But he becomes a player in Georgia politics in the period and in the run-up to the 2020 election, and is organizing folks to fight the results of the election, shows up on January 6th at the Gold Dome in Atlanta, the Georgia state capitol, demanding to see Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, and to confront him with his grievances as part of a whole militia that came to Georgia. I mean, this got very little, and then was like Raffensperger was quickly escorted by the state police out of his office to avoid a confrontation with Chester Doles. But he kind of reflects the ways that all sorts of extremist nutcases played a role in the Trump pressure campaign. And here's a guy who was at Charlottesville, during the riots there, who got into a melee defending his friend David Duke at the time, and talks about, I spent time with him, and he talks about how Trump emboldened him and his racist buddies. He pointed to the good people on both sides line and said that sent a message to him and his literal Confederates. And, it added, and I think as we conclude, it added to the air of menace that surrounded the whole attempts to, the whole pressure campaign on Georgia officials, that there were people out there like Chester Doles and his militia buddies who were pursuing and seeming to threaten people to do the president's bidding.
First of all, I think it's worth pointing out that the interview with Chester Doles took place in Cummings, Georgia, Forsyth County, which is Cummings is now a kind of a suburban city outside of Atlanta. But the history there is relevant very quickly. There was a lynching there in 1912. After that lynching, there was an enormous amount of racial terrorism, and that city was that county was essentially cleansed. Black people were forced out of the county, and Forsyth was cleansed. It was a racial cleansing. No Black people lived there or were allowed to move back in, really until 1987. This is a little known chapter of racism in this country, and I just think that's a little bit of a color that's interesting. And then the second thing, just to follow up on Mike's point about Trump stirring this up, let's remember Trump was pretty explicit about going after Black people in this country as being the source of all of this supposed voter fraud. He focused on urban areas, Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Fulton County. And last point is so much of the horrible threats against people in Georgia, poll workers, Ruby Freeman and her daughter Shay Moss, and so many other people were Black people in Georgia, and the threats were horribly racist, talking about lynchings and dragging people through the streets of Atlanta, by their trucks and so on and so forth. So the racial element, the racial dimension to this story, of course, against a backdrop of all of this history in Georgia with voter suppression and people losing their lives over the vote, is really an important part of the story.
Yeah, no, I thought the way, just like from the remarks Trump made about Charlottesville, this guy, Chester Doles, being there, being kind of inspired, signaled that this is great stuff. And then his connections were with Nazis and even the Turner Diaries. I mean, I don't know if you could, it just shows how deep and dark this thing can get, down the rabbit hole.
Absolutely. I mean, look, Chester Doles claimed to have forsworn racism and, gotten beyond his earlier Klan's views. And as we point out, that doesn't quite square with the public record. After being a Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, he was like the Georgia coordinator for the National Alliance, which was, in fact, a neo-Nazi group. He brings the author of the Turner Diaries to Georgia. Turner Diaries is that horrible racist fantasy about a race war. And of course, he shows up at Charlottesville. He's part of this, also the Hammerskins, which were a sort of, another racist skinhead group. He was a spear leader of that. So, he had plenty of connections to all these really far-right vicious groups. And the fact that he was in any way a player on the scene in Georgia says a lot about the continuation of, this strand of politics that's been there for many, many years.
And then he was trying to meet with Raffensperger on January 6th.
Yeah,
I have that
yeah.
right? And
I'm using quote fingers
exactly.
here. Meet.
Yeah. No, he was trying to stage a confrontation, going through the state capitol. His militia buddies were outside. This, probably would have gotten attention, more immediate attention, had it not been for what was going on at the same time that same day, January 6th in Washington. So it kind of overshadowed what was happening at the Georgia state capitol. But, we open that chapter, which is really the book 2 of the in Find Me the Votes, that we broke it down into 3 different sections. And this is the section about the conspiracy to overturn the results of the election. And I wanted to start there because it's just, as I said before, it's this sort of racist backdrop that was very much a part of the pushback on the election was part of is an important part of the story, and it sets up a lot of what happens afterwards.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what's still happening today. I mean, I think towards the end of that chapter, and this sort of getting into the physical danger for people like Raffensperger and Prosecutor Willis that you talk about, and also what we're seeing with people who are still mobilizing and being violent today. But you talk about, a kill list, I think, towards the end of that chapter. And I wonder if you could get into that a little bit. And particularly, the other thing I think you connect in the chapter is how foreign actors like Iran may have been involved in sort of fomenting, taking advantage of this racial divide.
Sure, they were playing up off of Trump's attacks, and you had Iranian-linked hackers who create this kill list in which they dox all the people who Trump was going after, including Brad Raffensperger, putting up, his home address, his personal cell phone, with targeting him, with a literal target. And many of the others, like Gabe Sterling, who was his director of operations. But it shows the way, foreign malevolent actors were exploiting our political divisions in the United States and picking up on the kind of turmoil that Trump was seeking to foment.
Was Doles involved in that in any way? And how do we know it was Iran? Was there, I think you mentioned an FBI.
But that was the FBI. Yeah, the FBI, at first, the suspicion was that it was, extremists like Chester Doles who had created this kill list. In fact, it was, the FBI determined it was foreign sourced. And that was an example of, foreign actors, malign actors, using our political divisions to exploit things. But, the important thing is this had horrific consequences. I mean, we'll get to the attacks and threats to people like Ruby Freeman and Shea Moss in a moment. But Raffensperger himself, comes under this enormous pressure. The Proud Boys show up at his house. MAGA warriors, harass his daughter-in-law and break into her house. His wife, Tricia Raffensperger, gets these horrible sexualized threats and messages on her cell phone. And, one of the dots we connect is, how did this all come about? Right? And it starts with, in Atlanta, a few days after the election, Don Jr. flies down to Atlanta. There's all these meetings in the Buckhead Republican Party headquarters, and he's demanding that everybody in the Republican Party in Georgia and Republican office holders get behind his president's, his father's attempts to overturn the results of the election, or his father, Donald Trump, the president of the United States, will tank the two Republicans running in the runoff in January. David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, the two incumbent senators who didn't get it to 50%. We're facing this runoff in January. Don Jr. is saying, you folks get behind my father, or your two Republican senators are gone. And what happens? Loeffler and Perdue put out this statement demanding that Raffensperger resign immediately. And that triggers all the threats against Brett Raffensperger. It's that night, the night that they put out that statement, that Tricia Raffensperger gets this barrage of cell phone calls and text messages at home, threatening her life, threatening all sorts of horrific sexual attacks.
It's amazing the courage that he and Willis and the two women you were talking about. Could you get into the rest of what they were all facing and your take on it?
Well, this is a story in some ways of unsung heroes in the battle against what Trump and his forces were doing. And it's from the highest levels of the government in Georgia. We Republicans, by the way, we call it the Republican iron wall of resistance. So Kemp, who was resisting these calls for a special legislative session, Carr, the Attorney General, who threatens to resign over all of this, and then we'll get into Jordan Fuchs, the political consultant working for Brad Raffensperger, who secretly taped the infamous call with the president.
The perfect phone call, right?
The perfect phone call, right? But the heroism all up and down the line in Georgia, and it is the difference between, I think, protecting our democracy surviving and not, is those individuals who stood up to Trump and who suffered terrible consequences because of it.
But on the terrible consequences, you want to talk about Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, because that is perhaps the most poignant story of all.
Yeah, I mean, look, these are two women, a mother and daughter. Ruby Freeman, I think 62-year-old grandmother, who volunteered in most elections as a poll worker because her mother had instilled in her the preciousness of being able to vote in Georgia after she had been through poll taxes and all of the other things to keep Black people in Georgia from voting in elections. And her daughter, Shay Moss, who worked for the Fulton County elections office as an elections administrator, they did nothing. They did their jobs. They did their civic duty to help people vote freely in Georgia. And the Trump people unleashed this torrent of violent and horrible threats. And it was more than just threats. People were showing up at their home. People were threatening to arrest them. People were, delivering, pizzas to their door on a regular basis. This was all based on the total distortion of a video that had been leaked out of election night at the State Farm Arena Center. Some suggestion that they were stuffing ballots, that they had taken a suitcase out from underneath the table when people weren't there. Total nonsense. And Rudy Giuliani and the others were spreading it around. The right-wing media ecosystem were jumping all over it, running pictures of them, supposed to look like mugshots because they were criminals. Giuliani testifying that they look like drug dealers scurrying around. I mean, a racial component to just about everything that was said about them by the Trump forces. And in the end, that becomes part of the investigation, these threats to Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. And it turns out, and although this was not uncovered by Fani Willis, it was actually uncovered by us, there are real ties between the Trump campaign and these people who were showing up at their doors at their homes and suggesting that if they didn't fess up, they would go to prison. It was people who worked for Black Voices for Trump.
And one of the indicted figures in the Fani Willis indictment is this character Willie Harrison Floyd, who was part of the whole Ruby Freeman intimidation campaign that drives her from her home. And he was a paid operative of the Trump campaign. He was working at a Trump campaign headquarters. It was paid over $100,000 during the course of the campaign. And he's one of the players who's intimidating Ruby Freeman. So it's just one more dot that we've been able to connect here.
So to zoom out a little bit, and we're already pretty far in the weeds here, but there's a quote about, and I know this was about the Raffensperger threat that I thought was really illustrative, that can kind of take us out and talk more about Fani Willis. But the episode was illustrative nonetheless of a nasty and menacing trend that was coursing through the state's politics, Georgia. It was a trend fueled by root causes, national in scope and years in the making, an increasingly polarized electorate, the erosion of trust in civic institutions, the advent of social media with its cordoned off silos filled with hate and conspiracy theories. I want to zoom out and do talk more about really most of the subject of the book is the whole Fani Willis saga. What did you guys, when you were covering this, and I know you got to talk to her dad, where did you see this whole thing going? Was there kind of a narrative about how she jumped in and what she had to do?
Well, it's an interesting story. Obviously, she's been embattled now, and we could talk about that and some of the allegations that are swirling around the case at the moment. But, it begins in a very, pedestrian in some ways, but illuminating way. The day that that Raffensperger phone call is January 2nd. And, as we discussed earlier, it's secretly taped by Raffensperger's top aide, and then it is leaked to the Washington Post and is out there in the public sphere. Everybody's dissecting it. The very next day is Fani Willis's first day in office as district attorney, and while everybody in the rest of the world is dissecting Trump's comments about find the votes and criminal prosecution if Raffensperger doesn't, Fani Willis is focused on a much narrower question, which only a veteran prosecutor would. Where was Raffensperger when he took that call? And it turned out he was in his home, his estate in Johns Creek, which is just inside the Fulton County border. And immediately, Fani Willis, once she learns that, realizes this is in her county, it's in her jurisdiction, and she's got an obligation to investigate. And, that's what sets this all off. She wasn't looking to investigate Donald Trump. She had a full plate and a very crowded agenda, thousands of unindicted murders and rapes and sexual assaults she had to deal with. That was what her campaign was all about, fighting crime. And now she's got this other potential crime that occurred in her jurisdiction, and it's what launches the investigation.
One of the dots you connected that I didn't even know about, I mean, for me personally, was, the influence her father, John Floyd, had on her. And it turns out he was working for Tom Bradley in Los Angeles as the campaign manager at the same time I was working for Tom Bradley in my first campaign.
Small world.
Really small world. But could you get into a little bit about his influence on her and
Yeah, he is a fascinating character. By the time you were working together, he had sort of shed his radicalism. John Floyd was born in South Central LA in a poor family. I think living with 16 relatives. Chickens in the backyard, and he's essentially raised by the streets, the gangs in his neighborhood. And we interviewed him at great length about all of this, and he's a wonderfully compelling character. His father was abusive, came home from the army, and was a drunk and abusive. And John Floyd got a lucky break, which is he was going to a parochial school, and the nuns there saw that he had significant potential and helped him along. He eventually goes to a community college, and then he joins the Kennedy campaign. And it's the civil rights era, and he goes down south to do organizing for voting. And growing up in L.A., he didn't see the kind of Jim Crow regime that existed in the South of the United States. So he is shocked and horrified when he sees the whites only signs, and he becomes increasingly radical and somewhat disillusioned with Martin Luther King's nonviolent approach, and ultimately joins Stokely Carmichael and other Black Power nationalists, and becomes a Black Panther. In fact, he becomes the founder of the L.A. chapter of the Black Panthers, which was an offshoot of Huey Newton and the others who were up in Oakland. And at one point, he's on a mission to provide security for H. Rap Brown, another one of these Black nationalists and Black Panthers, who was on trial for drug charges, gun charges in Louisiana. He ends up getting arrested by the police there, trumped up charges, ends up in prison for a couple of months. When he gets out of prison, and this is kind of the key moment in a way that ends up being important for the daughter that he would later have, Fani Willis, he decides that after that experience, he needs to dedicate the rest of his life to protecting and defending Black people who are targeted by the police and law enforcement. And he decides to go to law school, and he does. He goes to UCLA. Ultimately, he becomes a criminal defense lawyer and in Washington, D.C., practicing in D.C. Superior Court. And by now, he is raising Fani Willis on his own, single father, raising this little girl who comes to the courthouse with him, spends time with the judges there, and says, "Daddy, I want to be a judge." And John Floyd says to her, well, if you're going to be a judge, you're going to have to become a lawyer first. And the rest is history. She goes to law school. Interestingly, last thing I'll say about this is when she is serious about being a judge as she gets older, he says, well, you should be a prosecutor because that's a faster route to becoming a judge than if you're a criminal defense lawyer. So despite his background as a criminal defense lawyer, a civil libertarian, a radical, he wants her to become a prosecutor. She does. She becomes one of the best prosecutors probably who ever graced the courtrooms of Fulton County. And here we are with her prosecuting the ex-president of the United States. Huge influence on her. They are extremely close. He lives in Atlanta now. They talk 10 times a day, according to what Fani Willis told us.
I'll tell you, I was only 20, maybe 21 at the time. But if you told me 4 days ago before I picked up your book that my paths crossed with Fani Willis's father, and that I actually we were in the same campaign and working for Tom Bradley at the same time, I would have told you you're on Mars. But this gets into her. You have a chapter, the badass, but there's also this moment that you capture about the threats that she was taking and the body double episode. I think that does illustrate how dangerous the threats were, but how courageous her and others, these heroes that you talk about, were in those days.
It's an absolutely extraordinary story. We talked before about the threats to the Raffenspergers and Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, but the threats to Fani Willis were absolutely relentless and pretty scary. And look, a lot of it was riled up by Trump, right? He's calling Fani Willis a racist, a Marxist, a radical, encouraging his people to go after her. And they do in some pretty horrible ways. And as things got closer to the indictment, she's getting these calls on her personal cell phone from this digitally disguised voice threatening to kill her, threatening to rape her, using the N-word, but also bringing up her daughters and their names and where they live and threatening them. So it was, not just her, but her family as well. And then as indictment day approaches even more, they pick up a assassination threat on a MAGA website. The best time to shoot her is when she leaves the building. And this really spooks them. So we all remember in August when Fani Willis goes out late at night, it was midnight, and has her press conference unveiling the indictment, the racketeering conspiracy indictment against Donald Trump and 18 co-defendants, including Rudy Giuliani, Mark Meadows, John Eastman, and the rest. That makes instant headline news. Right after that press conference, unbeknown to we in the press at the time watching it, she goes back to her office, takes off her black business suit and pearls, puts on a baseball cap, t-shirt, and sweatpants, and a body double, somebody on the staff who resembles her, puts on a business suit looking exactly like what Fani Willis just wore, over, by the way, a Kevlar bulletproof vest, which a lot of them involved in the case had been wearing or had been assigned to wear for some time. And there's a decoy operation late at night. The body double and a team of others, drive out from the parking garage by the courthouse, and Fani Willis is smuggled out the back and driven to an undisclosed location at a local hotel. It's an incredibly dramatic story. I mean, can you imagine, just taking a step back, if Merrick Garland or Jack Smith had to get smuggled out of their office after a press conference because of an assassination threat? I mean, it would be like mind-boggling and huge news, but that was the reality for Fani Willis on the ground dealing with this in Georgia.
And guys, think of the poignant irony that Fani Willis is being victimized by the same kinds of horrific threats that she is methodically investigating in the cases of Ruby Freeman and Shea Moss and others. It gives you a sense of how pervasive all of this was in Georgia at that time. I say at that time, this is in August. It continues. It has persisted. And I think part of the reason we wrote the book was not just to tell a colorful tale of what happened in 2020. It's because this is the country that we live in now, and this is continuing. There are, of course, a lot of dangers of these things happening again in this next campaign, this current presidential campaign, which is, by the way, almost certainly going to be a repeat of 2020 with Trump and Biden.
What do you make of her situation now? Is this sort of more of the same piling on her? I mean, I know some of this is her own mistake, but how do you read? Will it have any impact on the case? Or
well, it's certainly sucked up a lot of media oxygen, and I think to state the obvious, it was a lapse in judgment to have had this relationship with Nathan Wade, the chief prosecutor in charge of the case. But that said, and by the way, I mean, she had made missteps before that we document in the book, most notoriously when she sponsored a fundraiser for a friend of hers who was running against one of the targets of her investigation that led the judge in charge of the matter to, that was, as he put it, it was a what were you thinking moment, and he disqualified Fani Willis from prosecuting that the opponent of her friend who she was helping. And certainly this, the relationship with Wade fits into that category of what were you thinking. But that said, I mean, it is important to sort of, first of all, she's going to respond. She has to by the end of this week. And, I think we can expect a vigorous response that will challenge at least some of the allegations that have been out there. But at the end of the day, there's absolutely no evidence that this had any impact at all on the case itself. None of the defendants were deprived their constitutional rights, or there was no evidence of prosecutorial misconduct in the way the investigation was conducted or the indictment brought. And I think the lawyers who have now adopted this motion, it began with Michael Roman, who was one of the implementers of the notorious fake elector scheme and has now been embraced by Donald Trump's legal team as well. And they're going to have a hard time making the case that this supposed conflict of interest, which, by the way, seems a little strained on its face, had any impact that was detrimental to their clients. And so we'll see. The judge has a hearing scheduled for February 15th on this matter. I mean, we're going to see her response in the next few days. And, it may be at the end of the day, we're talking about an inter-office romance, if that's what it was. I know a thing or two about sex scandals, having covered, a number of them in the course of my career. And as sex scandals go, this is pretty lame. It's two single people in their 50s having a relationship. There is a so what aspect to this.
We're getting towards the end here, but I want to get to sort of fitting into to this conversation. But the last line in the book is hers, and it's a quote: "When I walk into a courtroom, I'm always underestimated, and that can be a powerful thing." And so now you've talked to all these people. Would you recommend voting against her at this point, or?
I would not count Fani Willis out. She is tough and resilient. And as we talked about a little bit before in the conversation, she's already been through a lot investigating Donald Trump, and she has hung out. I will say that given this latest controversy, she may have lowered expectations. Maybe that will play to her advantage. I fully expected that she was going to be a significant courtroom presence in this case, assuming it went to trial. In fact, just a quick side point on Nathan Wade, he was never anticipated to be the lead trial lawyer at all, or the legal architect of this case. He was a behind-the-scenes player, an organizer of the case, a manager of the lawyers, running the grand jury process. Fani Willis, on the other hand, is a force in the courtroom. Legendary. I mean, young prosecutors in the Fulton County DA's office were instructed to go watch her trials, murder trials and rape trials and the like. And I know from having talked to people on her team, they actually want her to try a significant amount of this case. Whether she will or not, I don't know. How the latest controversy will affect that decision, I'm not sure. But if she gets through this, which I think she likely will, my guess is you're going to see her in the courtroom, maybe doing the opening statement, maybe cross-examining witnesses, and she will have been underestimated again. So I think that last line of the book may be prophetic.
Joe, I think that's a pretty good place for us to wrap up.
Thanks, Michael and Daniel, for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening to that Trippi show. Look, I can't speak more highly or recommend more highly that you go out and Find Me the Votes. We've covered like just a thin outline of page after page of these kind of details that these guys and dots that they've connected. I literally started it. I can't put it down until I got to that last line. And I really do believe that you'll get a much better understanding of the real threat that still exists. It's not just this story. It's not just about Fani Willis and the hard-charging prosecutor, a rogue president and the plot to steal an American election. It really is what Douglas Brinkley said, a narrative wake-up call and one hell of a great read. We'll put the book links in our show notes so that people can go there and link. But where can they find you on social media or read more about what you're doing?
I'm at Isikoff on X. That's at ISIKOFF. And Danny, you want to tell people where to find you?
Yeah, I'm at D Klaidman. That's DKLAIDMAN on X, formerly known as Twitter, and I think it's the same handle for Instagram and Facebook.
We'll include a link where you can buy the book in our show notes too.
Terrific. Thank you.
So thank you guys.
Really great to
appreciate
talk.
It. Yes, it was.
Yeah, that was fun. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Resolute Square.